righty. So thank you for that lovely introduction, Jasmine. And thank you to the folks at University of Wisconsin-La Crosse Division of Diversity and Inclusion for inviting me. And of course, thank you to all of the students, faculty, and staff who are joining me here in person and online. So when I was first invited to deliver this keynote, I must say I was surprised and a little scared, well, a lot of scared. This is my first year as a tenure track professor. I'm fresh out of graduate school. Most assistant professors at this stage are just trying to keep their heads above water, and I'm no different. And so I was going to say no. I had a lot of self-defeating thoughts. Do I know enough? Am I experienced enough? Do people care what? Oh, the clicker works. I can go to the next one.
Click on the computer and then it might kind of make it up.
Okay. Do people care what this little Black girl from Mississippi has to say? There are so many better options. Folks who have been engaging in environmentalism and environmental justice long before I was, and with a larger audience than my handful of Twitter followers and Instagram followers, and maybe the 10 folks who actually read my research. I was frightened. Fortunately, I was reminded of this quote. All of the women are white, all of the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. That's actually the title of a landmark Black feminist anthology in Black women's studies, first published in 1982. It espouses the nature and importance of Black women's studies and valuing the lives, the experiences, and the interests of Black women in academic spaces. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Black women and femmes whose work is in conversation with mine, as well as those who have inspired my work in affinity towards social justice and inequality. Also, April is International Black Women's History Month, so let's clap it up for that and for them. So let me move this out of the way because you can't see part of the slide. I don't want to leave Nina out. All righty. And so the work I'm going to be discussing today reflects that ongoing interest in social justice and the connections between inequality, the environment, and health. And so my big question is, my overall overarching question for my research is, how do systems of oppression, like racism, for example, shape the built environment, and how does that impact our health? Structural and institutional racism, much like intersectionality, have become the new buzzwords in news media and public discourse, as well as academic discourse, because they're provocative. It almost seems as if the world is having an aha moment. Now, of course, structural racism isn't new. Black, Indigenous peoples, and other members of the global racial majority have been calling out racism in institutions and policies and practically everywhere else for over a century. Black people specifically have called for real solutions for the impacts of the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow that impact Black people in present day. I guess now someone's actually listening. And listening is a good start, but it shouldn't take another 50 or 100 years to actually do something about it. And once folks actually start listening and believing that structural racism exists, we recognize that that continues to impact the health of various racial and ethnic groups and helps explain a lot of the differences in health that have dated back to some of the country's earliest health records. In a global pandemic, structural racism exacerbates existing inequality in ways that make communities more vulnerable for COVID-19. Even the American Medical Association voted to recognize structural and institutional racism as a public health threat. And so I started to think, how does structural racism play out in the built environment, and how does that influence health? So we know that individual health is a result of several factors. And we now recognize that systems of oppression influence each of these factors. Yes, even genetics. Folks who are familiar with epigenetics know that trauma as a result of any one of these isms can impact our children's children's children. But as an environmental sociologist, I'm especially interested in those last two bullet points, the communities where people live, work, and play, and the environments that people are exposed to. So I want to recite a poem to you all, and this may be familiar to some of you, so if it is, just let me know at the end. Sunny day, sweeping the clouds away, on my way to where the air is sweet. Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? Come and play, everything's a-okay. Friendly neighbors there, that's where we meet. Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? It's a magic carpet ride. Every door will open wide to happy people like you, happy people like. What a beautiful sunny day, sweeping the clouds away, on my way to where the air is sweet. Can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street? How to get to Sesame Street? How to get to Sesame Street? Now, I'm sure by now you recognize that poem as the opening theme to Sesame Street. And you're probably also wondering where I'm going with this. So Sesame Street represents a community on a street within an urban neighborhood in New York City, where the sky is sunny, the air is sweet, and folks get along just fine, happy and healthy. Unfortunately, though, we can probably all agree that most neighborhoods in urban cities aren't like Sesame Street. Our neighborhood is one of the central places in our lives. It's where we live, where we play, where we do our shopping, where we form relationships, and where we watch our families grow. But what happens when our neighborhood is bad for our health? Research shows that for many, the neighborhood is a site of inequality. And that inequality has implications not only for health and well-being, but also for upward mobility and life chances. And though we are over 50 years out from desegregation, many neighborhoods across cities are still segregated by race and class. This economic and racial segregation concentrates marginalized racial and ethnic groups and the working class in neighborhoods. There are lots of ways that neighborhoods can be unequal, but I focus on deserts. And those are usually defined as neighborhoods where residents don't have adequate access to resources within a reasonable distance. I use the term desert to not only highlight the geographic, spatial, and place-based nature of resource scarcity, so deserts as actual geographic places with geographic boundaries, but to also highlight that although urban deserts lack one or more important resources, like actual deserts that have a shortage of water, they are still teeming with life. These are not dead places. People continue to adapt and create community and sovereignty despite the failures of local, state, or national government to create policies to ensure access. And access to resources like parks, tree cover, grocery stores, healthcare providers, and pharmacies have been at the forefront of discussion in the public sphere. Yet access is still a barrier for certain groups of people. And the global pandemic and now more recent inflation have only exacerbated these issues of access. But neighborhoods don't just randomly become deserts. Racialized historical processes rooted in racial capitalism and environmental racism create deserts. And so racial capitalism involves the process of, I know it's a cool word, right? It's provocative. It involves the process of deriving social and economic value from the racial identity of another person. And so it hinges on this idea that both racism and capitalism are like a really evil Batman and Superman. That, now you can guess which one is capitalism, Batman. And also it makes sense that Superman is racist because you can't kill him except with kryptonite, but it's hard to find. So, So I'm sorry. So essentially, racism and capitalism are like Batman and Superman, which means they are interdependent and they work in tandem to systematically disadvantage and exploit Black people and other racial minorities. And so racial capitalism argues that, quote, Black neighborhoods or communities that are perceived as Black are rendered valueless. And this devaluation of Black spaces renders Black neighborhoods unappealing for economic investment and development, but also dispensable for toxic industry siting. And so this plays out in neighborhoods in terms of resources, like those I've mentioned, grocery stores, parks, pharmacies, etc. But environmental racism, racial capitalism operate in a way that creates and reproduces inequality in multiple ways and of multiple types. So what does that mean? So neighborhoods might not only lack access to a grocery store, or only a park or walking trail, or only a pharmacy or other resource, but often also lack access to multiple resources. So I coined this term, multiply deserted area, or MDA for short, to describe a community or neighborhood in which there is a compounded, co-occurring resource scarcity. And based on what we know about the nature of environmental injustice in the US, I wanted to understand whether MDAs actually existed across the US, and also whether the demographics of neighborhoods could possibly predict whether a neighborhood is an MDA. And so the neighborhoods that I focus on and the neighborhoods that I talk about today are in urban counties in the southern United States. And I chose this region of the US for both personal and empirical reasons. I'm a native of a southern urban city. Shout out to Jackson, Mississippi. I think I'm one of the best things to come out of there. And I also recognize the scant research on urban life and urban experiences in southern US context. So much of the research on urban inequality and all these things has traditionally examined cities like New York City, Chicago, and Philadelphia. But in the words of the great wordsmith, Andre 3000 of the group Outkast, the South got something to say. Now, bonus points for who can tell me what the setting was for this. For $1 million.
That's an award show.
Okay, you gotta be more specific.
No, it's on the tip of my tongue.
I don't have $1 million, so I'm hoping you don't. So don't hold me to the $1 million part, because I don't have that. $1 afterwards. It was a Source Award. Okay. So after months of data collection using census tracts, which are really good proxies for neighborhoods, and this is just a step-by-step process of how I created those green desert and pharmacy desert measures, I found that a quarter of neighborhoods in my sample are actually multiply deserted areas, and over half of neighborhoods in my sample were a desert of at least one type. So MDA is a thing. That's which I was happy about, but also not happy because it's not a good thing. But they exist. In terms of some of my other, let me exit that out just so you could just see the words. Okay, there we go. In terms of my other findings, I found that predominantly Black neighborhoods are actually nearly 3 times more likely to be MDAs than non-predominantly Black neighborhoods. And so what that means is if the neighborhood that you live in is predominantly Black, in this case, at least 70% Black or more, it is almost 3 times more likely to lack access to multiple resources. The key part here is that it is the predominantly Black neighborhoods in particular. Oh yeah, thank you. So a neighborhood being 1/3 or 2/3 Black doesn't necessarily impact the odds of it being an MDA. And by itself, neither does household income. So whether or not you live, or whether the average household income in your neighborhood is high or low, doesn't by itself actually predict whether the neighborhood is an MDA or not. And so I wanted to think about the intersections of race and class. And I asked, would income matter for predominantly Black neighborhoods, right? And what I found was, when we look at the intersections between race and class, so how race and class dynamics might work together, we see that MDAs that are moderately or predominantly Black are actually more likely to be an MDA as average household income increases, which is really counterintuitive of what we know about the positive impacts of wealth and income in terms of life chances, resource access, neighborhood quality, and health. So Prince George's County and Fulton County, which is part of Atlanta, are both included in this sample and are really great examples of the ways in which race and class interact in really counterintuitive ways to disadvantage Black people in neighborhoods. So the average median household income for neighborhoods in Prince George's County is nearly $81,000, which was higher than most of the counties in my sample, and I believe higher than the national average. And Prince George's County is on average about 63% Black. And despite this wealth, more than half of the neighborhoods in that county are MDAs. Similarly, the average median household income for Fulton County, which is part of Atlanta, is $67,000, which is still higher than most of the counties in my sample, most of the neighborhoods in my sample. And Fulton County is over 47% Black. And despite having higher median household income than most counties in the sample, 40% of neighborhoods are MDAs. So here I began thinking, all right, there's a pattern in terms of race and class. How might these patterns of spatial inequality be impacting health for folks in these neighborhoods? All right, show of hands, how many of you shop for groceries? How many of you pick up or purchase prescriptions or medical supplies on a normal basis for either yourself or a family member or a friend? All right, how many of you enjoy going to the park or another open green space to exercise or for leisure, get a little dose of nature? Okay, good. Now imagine if those simple tasks, getting groceries, filling prescriptions, getting fresh air and a dose of nature, meant driving 15 minutes or more one way. Now, if you have a personal vehicle and you have money for gas, maybe that's not too much of a hassle. But imagine if you didn't. Imagine if you had to rely on public transit, or walk, or rely on the kindness of a friend or a family member or a neighbor. Perhaps you live in an urban heat island, and so even if you wanted to walk maybe half a mile in that heat, that could be exhausting or dangerous. And that's assuming that you can walk, right? Would all of that feel like a hassle? Would that be stressful? I'm gonna be honest with you all. I live 12 minutes, it's a 12-minute drive to my gym. And some days, that 12-minute drive is too much. If it were down the street, you know, I might go more regularly. But that 12-minute drive is sometimes too much, right? And that's something that I do for leisure. So think about these things that aren't for leisure, things that are necessities for, if not day-to-day, at least week-to-week life. And so that got me thinking about stress theory and the stress process model and how that might help explain the impact of this neighborhood resource scarcity on health. And so folks who are familiar with work on the connection between stress and health might recognize this model. And essentially what the stress process asserts is that the social statuses, our social statuses like our race, socioeconomic status, gender, etc., it determines the conditions of our lives. And that leads to differences in stress exposure and also differences in the coping resources that we have available to us to deal with that stress exposure. And that variation leads to differences in physical and mental health outcomes. And so I thought, what if I apply that same line of thinking to neighborhoods, right? So living in an MDA has direct health effects because it's related to having less access to these health-related resources. And then an indirect effect such that having to figure out how to buy groceries and medicines and find green space is stressful. And so this represents that daily, inconvenient insecurity in obtaining necessary resources each day. And based on what we know about how the built environment is shaped by processes involving structural racism, I highlight both the basis and the consequences of neighborhood spatial inequality that has been shaped by racism. And so in terms of the impacts on health, I found that multiply deserted areas actually have higher prevalence of inactivity. You see the sloth? I'm glad you see the connection and activity and sloth. Asthma, diabetes, obesity, and poor mental health compared to neighborhoods with low or no resource scarcity, right? So where you live can impact your health, right? Again, I wanted to look, I was still thinking about those intersections between race and class, and I found that across each physical health outcome, MDAs that were predominantly Black had higher prevalence of each of these outcomes relative to MDAs that were not predominantly Black, so whiter and or more racially heterogeneous neighborhoods. And the pattern was the same for mental health as well, so for the mental health outcome. And class matters in terms of median household income, at least for obesity and for poor mental health. And so MDAs that were higher income had lower prevalence of both obesity and poor mental health relative to MDAs that were lower income, which is pretty intuitive to what we know about class and health and access and resources. And so two main conclusions can be drawn from this research, right? Race and class demographics of neighborhoods shaped by racial capitalism and environmental racism can predict multiple resource scarcity in neighborhoods. And co-occurring neighborhood resource scarcity via multiply deserted areas can negatively impact health outcomes. And then race and class kind of influence that impact in counterintuitive and more intuitive ways. So after doing this research, in true Black feminist fashion, as I was doing this research, I did some critical reflection about the nature of the research that I was doing, right? This macro level research, right? Objective measures, quant. And let me do this. And I'll read it. Give us what we need, not what you think we need. But in order to know what we need, I mean, somebody got to sit down and talk to us. That doesn't happen. This statement was made by one of the 21 respondents that I interviewed as the third leg of this research, right? So I did this big macro level research, and I knew that, yes, it's important to have these large samples of data and create some empirical foundation for this type of inequality, but do we really know what we're talking about if we haven't talked to anyone in these neighborhoods, right? And so that's what I did. And the picture in the background is actually a photo of the exit onto the main road of the neighborhood where these respondents live in my hometown of Jackson, Mississippi. And it's named after the prominent civil rights leader, Medgar Wiley Evers. If you don't know, in 1963, Evers was assassinated in his driveway just a block away from where I conducted this leg of my research. And so this statement echoes those of other residents in quote unquote disadvantaged urban US communities who would like to be heard when it comes to the needs of their neighborhood. Right? And so this quote is also directly relevant to one of the limitations of the macro level research that I just talked about. Findings of these studies, as I said, reveal these really racialized patterns of inequality and how they have negative implications for health, which is awesome. Yet little is known about how individuals who actually live in those neighborhoods actually experience this resource scarcity, right? And how that impacts their feelings, their emotions, their behaviors related to the neighborhood. Now, emphasizing this break in our understanding of neighborhood disadvantage, Rashida Taylor, who is pictured, I think, on the third slide, who's a pioneer in environmental justice and a Black woman. She published research on food deserts, and basically she mentioned that this macro level quantitative research is good, but it reduces people to dots on a map, right? And sometimes when you're immersed in quantitative data, you forget that these dots, these are people, and these are their lives. And it's really presumptuous to assume to know not only what's going on from their perception as people who actually live in the neighborhood, but also how that impacts their health. And so this critique is valid because studies show that despite a lack of access to supermarkets, many residents in minority neighborhoods have access to food via alternative sources, so ethnic markets and small grocery stores. Additionally, current research on food deserts shows that people create their own community gardens and create their own food sovereignty in response to limited food access. And so ignoring this is particularly troublesome because many of the individuals living in these, quote, desert neighborhoods, namely Black and or poor people, have already been pushed to the margins in silence, both in sociological study, but also in broader society. And so I wanted to speak to residents and understand perceptions of what I have been calling this objective access. So essentially what I found was that despite being in an MDA, objectively, so they lived more than a mile away from a grocery store, or pharmacy, or park, almost half, 42% of residents in the sample felt that they did have access to at least two of the resources. Other findings were that distance was, of course, relevant to their understandings of perceptions in terms of their access of grocery stores and pharmacies and parks. And distance was the most salient for residents who didn't have personal vehicles, which makes a lot of sense, right? Distance matters more if I have to walk or if I have to get a ride rather than just drive. And distance also was an important factor for older individuals, especially in terms of that access to pharmacies. Other insights were that some residents, it was particularly single men without children, thought about their access to food very differently than I had assumed. They thought about their access to food in terms of their access to casual dining and fast food restaurants and hot food from grocery store delis, as well as convenience stores. And so grocery stores weren't even in their minds when they thought about access to food, right? And so you can think about how important that is from a quantitative perspective. If I'm calling or if I'm naming neighborhoods food deserts, but some people in that neighborhood don't see themselves as living in a food desert or not having access because they don't buy groceries, especially the single men in my sample, right? And so lastly, a really important factor is that even when residents identified a resource within or near their neighborhood, there were other issues outside of distance. Quality matter, right? So maybe, yeah, we do have a grocery store. I feel like I have a grocery store in my neighborhood, but the lines are too long. Or the fresh food there is really bad. Or I buy a pack of meat on Sunday and by Tuesday it's full. Same thing with parks. They'd say, oh, well, yeah, there's a park in my neighborhood, but I never go because everything's broken. Or it gets too hot. Or I have concerns about crime and safety. So quality and quantity of resources also matter in terms of people's perceptions of access. And that also varied according to marital status and parental status. Right? And so I mentioned this, click it again. I mentioned this because had I not taken the time to actually talk to folks in these neighborhoods and not only ask them about their experience, but ask them about what they believe they needed in their neighborhood, I wouldn't have gotten that nuance and complexity around resource scarcity for Black folks living in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And so this highlights why intersectional environmental justice matters. Taking an intersectional approach to environmental justice means first recognizing that reproductive justice and disability justice and climate justice is also environmental justice. And all of those things are social justice. It examines how scholars and activists use intersectionality to reveal multiple and interlocking identities and injustices that, when made visible, that's the key, when made visible, it can enable coalition building to eliminate all systems of oppression across a wide spectrum of social movements. Intersectional environmental justice is also about recognizing that we all cannot focus on a single issue because none of us live single issue lives, right? And that's a quote from Audre Lorde. Our unique social location, as well as our geographic location, shapes our experiences, our health, and just about every aspect of our lives. And the sooner we can integrate the collective of research and action and policymaking focused on each of these individually to a comprehensive focus on intersection environmental justice in every way, we can get justice for all. And the sooner we can see real change for all global citizens. Because in the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was once just a little Black girl from Mississippi like me, nobody's free until everybody's free. Thank my funding. Shout out to Vanderbilt and Ford and these folks. And I look forward to your questions and your feedback. Yeah, go back to. Am I? Or, okay. I didn't know if I was supposed to. Go ahead.
I don't know if you want to do the mic or no.
Actually, just speak loud.
I'll speak loud. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I
Thank
happen to
you.
be in an environmental justice class this semester, and
Cool.
so a lot of things you're talking about is like, no, that makes sense. We talked about that in class. That was
Nice.
really fun. One of the things I was thinking about in class, was at one point in the class you're talking about how different environmental sociologists, utilize data. Like you're talking about county data about income. And so I'm curious, like in your data, were you using county data or are you using census tracts or that kind of stuff?
I was just, it was a hodgepodge of data, honestly. And that's kind of what you have to do in many cases when the data isn't available. So the sample was based on counties. Okay. So I picked urban counties, one urban county within each of the 17 southern states, 16 southern states plus DC. Which some people argue is not the South, but I don't argue with the census. The census says it is, along with Delaware and Oklahoma and but I consider West Virginia the South. Anywho, and so I picked those counties, but that's where it stopped in terms of county level analysis. But I used all of the populated census tracts in those counties, and then I matched it with census tract level health data. Yeah.
And then my other question is I'm curious more about how you, like, what qualifies something as being a food desert? Is it like a density of grocery stores in an area, or is it just the distance? So
there's different measures of access of all of these things, green space in particular. But for food deserts, there's also different measures. The measure that I used was just where's the center of population, right? So where do most of the people live in their neighborhood? And is the center of population, like, is a resource within 1 mile of that center of population? And if not, then it's a desert. And I used 1 mile because I was looking at southern urban cities. Had I been looking in the Northeast, or maybe even major cities in the Midwest, like Chicago or Detroit, I'd do a ½ mile, because cities are just spatially arranged very different in the South versus the Northeast and Midwest. But yeah, so it was just distance. But there's other ways to measure deserts and access for sure, like travel time and things like that. Yeah.
There is another question.
Okay. Oh, I think I could. Is it in the chat or?
Yes.
Let me see.
Okay.
All right. Superfund Site. So listen, who is that? Tisha, my original plan for my dissertation was for it to be this mega environmental justice research. And so I was going to do the access, but also include Superfund Site location as well. So have I thought about it? Yes. My advisor said, Lacey, you won't graduate if you keep adding, variables and data. So I haven't done it, but I'm definitely looking into that for future research for sure. Yeah, maybe listen, I got a couple things in the works. Keep on the lookout.
What is Superfund Site?
So a Superfund site it's usually it used to be like an industrial facility site. So now it's like a brownfield, and it's a site that's deemed by the EPA to receive money for cleanup and remediation, right? And so the assumption there is that there's still like toxic hazardous materials in and around that site. Yeah. Right.
I guess one question I always have when we learn about instances of environmental injustice is just what does action look like to make these instances better? Like, what can we do as co-conspirators? What can policymakers do? What can anyone? Where do we move from this now that we have this data documenting this need?
Good question. So there's different points where you can have action. One point, of course, is like in terms of like civic things. So at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level, because so the EPA is a government organization created to protect the environment and the people in the environment and create like a balance between development and like harm to the natural environment and humans. But depending on administration, the EPA looks and operates very differently, right? And so that at the national level it matters, but also at the local level. So when we vote for like city council members, those are the people who give permits to certain industries to site, right? They're the ones who have the power to say yes you can or no you can't. And so that matters also. There's also like grassroots organizations, especially within urban cities, that aid in not only just this issue of environmental justice, but other issues. And so there's like greening initiatives in cities. There's plenty of initiatives in Boston around like planting trees and saving trees from being like uprooted during like urban renewal. In terms of this issue in particular, a lot of it is policy level, right? And so understanding that just creating a grocery store or putting a grocery store in a neighborhood isn't enough, because depending on what's going on in terms of neighborhood change, you can have a grocery store that long-term residents don't go to because there's symbolic boundaries, right? So there's access physically, but it's like a food mirage. So that's an issue. And then community gardens are a big thing in Boston. In the neighborhood, I live in Roxbury in Boston, so there's several community gardens. That's one way that people have been a part of change to increase access to food, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I was visiting my brother, and he lives in St. Louis. He lives in like the city proper, and I don't know like what side of St. Louis it is technically.
Okay.
But the area that he lives in, it's definitely kind of like an area where like there was a lot of like quick urban development and then kind of decayed a little bit. And now a lot of the properties have been kind of like bought up by like land moguls, and there's a lot of like coming soon signs, like fancy, snazzy new businesses. But it's like even if those businesses have moved in, like if I lived in a neighborhood, I wouldn't want to go to that because it's like that's not the neighborhood. That's not like what's been there. Like I'm wondering like if there are terms for that specific phenomenon, like is it studied?
So in terms of within one city or one large neighborhood within a city, there being lots of new condos and businesses, and then across the street or down the block there being dilapidated homes, and the opposite, that's the term for that is like uneven development. And in terms of like people not wanting to go to the new places, there's work on what I mentioned around symbolic boundaries. So essentially the boundary is not real in terms of, they aren't saying no low-income people can come in, but they create some businesses and urban planners like create an aesthetic that makes it seem for long-term residents or low-income residents that that's not their place. Like it's in my neighborhood, but if I go there, I'm going to feel uncomfortable, and people are going to look at me differently. And so that's called like symbolic boundaries in places. Yeah. What?
I'm just thinking about even here in the Crosse, like in Alaska, there's
So I have, there is research, not for like a ton of grocery stores in urban cities, but like the dollar store like epidemic, especially in the South. In the North, like in Boston, I feel like there's some sort of like city like ordinance around like you're not going to put too many Family Dollars or Dollar Generals here. But in the South, they're like, remember when Starbucks first like hit the scene? They were on every corner. That's how it is with dollar stores in cities in the South. Like, you know. Yeah, so that's a thing. But in terms of something more similar to this, there's work on food swamps, which is kind of the opposite. So that's like a neighborhood, a community where there's a lot of not so healthy food resources. So a lot of fast food places and things like that. But I don't think I've read or seen any work on like a bunch of grocery stores in one neighborhood and like how that impacts things. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off that, is there any measure to like quality of food when determining like a food desert?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, there's different ways to measure access, and one of the ways is quality. There's research out of New York City where researchers not only map where the food destinations were, so like the more formal grocery stores, but also like the smaller grocers and the bodegas. And researchers actually went into each store and did like a quality check, and like they had like a list of like, oh, do they have, you know, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables? Is there meat? Is there milk? Is there eggs? And so that is a thing, and that research is done, and that for some researchers is a part of like this determination of access, because that's really important, right? And that came up in my research when I interviewed folks. So they say like the grocery store is there, but like the lines are too long, or like there's nothing that I want there in terms of fresh vegetables. So they go there for like snacks and cereal and like the packaged dry goods, but they still have to like drive 15 minutes to a Walmart or like a bigger store to get like the fruits and the vegetables and the meat. So yeah.
So I'm a little bit of a stats nerd. So when you were talking about predicting neighborhoods that would be MBAs, I'm curious about the variables that you used in order to like predict whether or not a neighborhood would be an MBA, and if there were more opportunities for adding additional variables to like see what intersects in terms of that model.
And I wish I had the table here, but I don't want to put the table because, you know, sometimes tables go, you know, it gets a little out of hand. So I didn't include the table, but yes, so in the prediction of whether or not a neighborhood was going to be an MDA, there was, of course, the predominantly Black variable and median household income. And then I controlled for like geographic things like population density and actual like area at the county level and at the neighborhood level, but also the percent of folks who own a vehicle, percent of folks who walk to work, and that was more like the only measure in census data that measures some sort of physical activity. Percent of like homeowners, because that's been shown to predict neighborhood disadvantage more broadly. What else? Percent foreign-born population. And I control for whether or not the neighborhood was designated as an opportunity zone, which is a new policy that came, that was enacted in 2017, which basically marks a census tract or neighborhood for like incentives for developers. And so if you're an opportunity zone, that means if a developer decides to create businesses or housing, they get like a tax write-off or some incentive. And so yeah, those are, I think those are all the variables I included. I'm probably forgetting a couple, but those were the main variables. And there was like, I didn't do interactions past my main ones because sometimes you just got to stick to, you know, and then look at it later. But those things were significant in terms of predicting whether or not a neighborhood. So yes, there was, I think every variable I mentioned was significant in terms of prediction, just in different, more or less, depending on the variable. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
With these tax write-offs, would there be like a fear of like gentrification of these neighborhoods that like that don't have the food desert or that have the food deserts and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the kind of, and I you know how you plan to do stuff, but you never get to it. Once I included that variable, I was like, oh, I have to do a real like good analysis on like what came to be after these neighborhoods were designated as opportunity zones, and like what happened, and was there displacement, and was there neighborhood change. And I do think that's a real fear, because that's what happens a lot when development happens in neighborhoods and there aren't like protocols and standards put in place beforehand and to prevent displacement, right? And also just feedback and inclusion of the existing residents. I think that happens. I'm actually getting ready to do some research looking at just that. They're redeveloping a public housing complex in Boston, and they're going to change it from like normal public housing, right? So for low income folks to mixed income. And they'll be looking at that process over 5 years and understanding whether or not long-term, if their health changes, if their stress exposure changes, because the assumption is, oh, when you mix income in a neighborhood, everyone succeeds, everyone does better, everyone's health is better, academic outcomes are better. So we'll see, but yeah, there is research on that.
Any other questions?
Just real quickly, what would you suggest in a community size of the Crosse and second smaller suburban rural environment? How do we start this conversations? Just, and I know many of them have started, but how do we sustain this?
That's a good question.
Very things you're talking about are just like,
I think one way to continue those conversations is just to continue, as far as like campus-wide, I can continue to have programming like this throughout the year, and like inclusion. I don't know if you all have like an environmental studies program or like an environment, like inclusion of those classes. I don't know if you all have like the core where like everyone has to take this set of courses in order to matriculate, like including social justice, environmental justice types of courses in the core, so that everyone gets exposure to that, I think is important. Maybe if there are organizations in and around La Crosse, like including them, and I know college students are always looking for ways to like for volunteer or for internships, so creating partnerships with those organizations may be a way also. Yeah, some great questions. I'm proud of y'all.
Well, Dr. Lacee, we want to thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We want to say also thank you to Dana, who has been translating for us.
Yes, thank you.
Everyone for coming to this presentation, and tomorrow is our last day. We have a few events, but if you cannot come during the presentations, we have the event, the fun event, the jazz band will be here. What time? 5 to 7. 5 to 7.
E-cafe.
E-cafe. Just relax, enjoy, and then have some snacks. We have appreciated seeing you and your faces. And just don't forget to follow diversity at University of Select for us, our social media, and we love your involvement. And Mario is laughing because I just said UW University.